gonna draw, 'cause I'm laying down the law. We're gonna art. If you don't like it, smell a flower. 'Cause I'm not good without power. Who's the boss? Who's the boss? Who's the boss? If you have a glass, it's clean with rubber.
Hello and welcome to Painting with Rob Boss. Today we're going to be doing a Scratchboard Lion. You're going to need a Scratchboard, a lion drawing, you can use mine or make one of your own, a ballpoint pen, and Scratchboard tools. We're going to start here by transferring our drawing onto our Scratchboard. This is a useful technique because you can sketch out what you want to put on your Scratchboard, and if you make a mistake, you can correct it and then transfer the drawing onto your Scratchboard. So we're going to tape them together. Scratchboard can be a little unforgiving because it's hard to undo your mistakes. So this way you can at least get your sketch done before you have to worry about doing everything perfectly on the Scratchboard. So we're going to tape them together so they're perfectly lined up, and we've got a little hinge opening here. So next we're going to take a ballpoint pen, and all we're going to do is trace the drawing here, and it's going to transfer a faint line onto the Scratchboard. You want to use a regular ballpoint pen, ideally with a kind of thicker tip, and you want to press firmly to get a good transfer. You're just going to work your way through the entire drawing, tracing over everything. Now, I find that it's a lot easier if you use a contrasting color. Here I've got my red ballpoint pen, and that way I can see where I've already traced. If you use a black one, it can be a little tricky to see where you have to trace or where you've already traced. You can always lift up the drawing with that little tape hinge, and by doing that you can take a look underneath, but it's easier if you don't have to peek all the time. So we're just kind of working our way through the whole thing. This lower lip, the two teeth, and remember to apply firm pressure. You want to press down, not necessarily as hard as you possibly can, but you want to press down hard. And you can peek and see if everything's transferring if you want to make sure. The line is going to be kind of faint. It needs to catch the light the right way for you to see it, but it makes a nice line that's not going to interfere with our Scratchboard at all, or not much anyway. You can also sketch with a graphite pencil directly on the Scratchboard. Now when you erase the pencil, it's going to leave a slightly different shine on the Scratchboard than before you drew on it and erased. So it's going to change the reflectiveness of the surface. It's going to make it a little duller. And if you're just doing like a simple line drawing on your Scratchboard, that can be really noticeable. Now if you're doing a complex drawing like we're going to try to do today with a lot of different textures and cross contours and shading and all of that jazz, if you're going to do a more complex drawing, then those erasures are not as noticeable. So that can be a good way to do it. But if you're doing a simple line drawing, you probably want to use this transfer technique instead. Alright, so we're just kind of getting all of this. There's not that much to say about this. It's just kind of, tracing over all these lines. I'm leaving this at its original length just because, you can work through as I work through. Alright, so there we go. And now when we lift this up, you see nothing, but it's there. Oh, maybe you kind of caught it a little bit. So I'm going to show you. This is what it looks like when I hold it up to the camera. And you can see, depending on the angle, it can be really difficult to see or a little easier. Alright, so I'm going to go ahead and start drawing over my transfer here with my Scribe Tool. So the Scribe Tool is just like basically a needle with a handle on it. Now you can use pretty much anything that is sharp on a scratchboard. We've got some specific scratchboard tools, but you can improvise them as well. I'm going to be showing you some specific scratchboard tools here. Once I start doing this, I need to kind of think in reverse, because unlike most of the time where when we draw it makes a dark mark, this does the opposite. And when we draw, it makes a light mark. So the scratchboard is actually a white sheet of paper that's coated usually with like a wax, and then this layer of almost like a black ink or paint is applied to it. And what happens is when you scratch it, it comes off because it doesn't have a great bond with the wax. So when we scratch into this, we don't want to scratch super deep. We want to kind of do it as gently as we can get away with. Now if you don't apply enough pressure, and sometimes the tools can be tricky, the black won't come off. But we don't want to do so much pressure that we're digging into the actual paper. We just want to do enough to scratch off the ink. You can see my line starting to emerge. Now the tool's giving me a little bit of trouble. If the tool doesn't seem to be scratching, you can kind of rotate it in your fingers and get it going a different direction. Sometimes the tips on these get kind of bent and hooked over, and that makes it so that it's hard for it to scratch certain directions. So that's another reason we don't want to press too hard on these, because we don't want to bend the tip. We want to keep the point straight, and that works best if we don't press into it, because that'll bend the tip and make it hard to scratch in certain directions. So I just kind of follow through and redraw my entire transferred image. I'm going to speed this up a little bit. Same idea as before, just kind of working your way through, scratching everything. And if you don't get a good transfer, you can't see all the way, you might want to lay it down and try transferring again. Try going a little more firm with your ballpoint pen. As far as the mane back here goes, I think you could probably just improvise the mane if it came down to it. It doesn't necessarily matter that everything look exactly like mine. Alright, you can pause the video here if you need to catch up. We're just trying to get that line drawing transferred onto our scratchboard here. So now we're going to get to the fun part of the scratchboard, in my opinion, which is adding the shading and textures. So, scratchboard, I think, is fine for doing line drawings, but it really shines when you start adding shading and textures. So we're going to start adding a furry texture, and we're going to use that texture to also shade the lion. So I'm just using sort of short strokes and thinking about the direction the fur would be going. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to have the light coming in from the right hand side and up above. So anything that's facing that direction is going to be lighter. Anything that's facing more towards us, the viewer, is going to be kind of a medium tone. And then anything that's kind of facing down is going to be in the shadow. So what that means is I want a higher concentration of fur in the light areas, a little less in the medium areas, and then even less in the dark areas. Here on the snout here, I'm kind of doing little cross contours, so little kind of C shapes, curving around to give that a little bit of form and definition. Alright, I'm going to speed this up a little bit. Alright, so I'm just kind of continuing to shade in that snout, or lighten in that snout. Here I'm kind of defining a black area for the eye. Again, we're working in reverse, and I want the eye to be black, so I have to kind of outline it. This is going to be kind of my Terminator line, where the medium tone fades into the shadow. I'm going to have kind of a medium shading here. I'm outlining those little creases at the corner of the mouth because I want those to remain black. adding some lightness in the snout here at the muzzle. I think the muzzle, the hair is going to be a little bit longer, so I'm using slightly longer strokes, kind of defining a white border for the nose. The Scratchboard favors having a little bit looser drawing style, I think, unless you're going to go really meticulous. Adding a little white around that eye. Here we've got the curve of the cheek. The cheek's going to be sticking out a little bit, catching a little more light. So I'm going to lighten the cheek a little bit more than the surrounding area. And we're starting to get a little bit of texture and form out of the face here. Alright, so here I'm using a broader Scratchboard tool. You should try out the different tools you have and see what works best for you. I find that this little leaf-shaped tool works really well. It's got kind of a curved leaf tip to it. Takes off a little more pigment, makes kind of a wider line, so it makes it a little quicker for these really light areas. Lighten up the teeth here. Leave a little bit of black up at the top, kind of a cast shadow. Lighten up the lower lip here. That's going to be catching some light from above. Lighten things up a little bit through here. So this cheek and this tuft of hair, I think, are going to be catching a little more light. Then we can start working into the mane. But before that, let's take a little break. So if you want to pause it here and get caught up, you can do that, and then we'll work on the mane. For the mane here, we're going to use a variety of drawing tools. I'm going to use kind of this leaf end on this stylus here and kind of lighten up the parts of the mane that are going to be facing the light. So I want to think about that light coming in from the right hand side and up above. So anything that's facing up or to the right, it's going to have a little extra light on it. This is kind of cool because you actually think about where the light is hitting, and that's where you'll add more scratch. Here I've got a little wire brush. This is really good for adding a lot of texture at the same time. Things like long hair. It's also a little bit random where it applies the texture, which makes it look, I think, a little more realistic. So I'm just going to do this to get a little bit of base texture. I can also do it to add lighting effects. So anywhere that I work it more is going to start to lighten up. So all through here, I'm going to kind of lighten this up, have a little bit of light reflecting off of the hair. I'm going to get the entire mane just scratched up a little bit to show that flowing mane. That proud flowing mane. It's beautiful. Just anywhere you want it lighter, you can just hit it a little bit harder, a little bit longer. So you could do all this texture with just the Scribe. You could just use one of the stylus tools. Varying it up a little bit gives you variety, makes it a little more interesting. I'll come back in and lighten some of these areas up a little bit. And you can just lighten as needed. You can start adjusting kind of on your own now, trying to figure out where you want things to be lightened up, where you want there to be more texture, etc. So you can see adding these textures and light effects makes things a lot more interesting. I think the muzzle needs to be a little lighter here. The fur gets a little lighter up there, and it's a little bit longer. It's also going to be catching a lot of light. Really going to lighten up this part of the mane here because it's going to be catching a lot of light, and I also want to have a nice contrast with the face. I'm going to add a little bit of texture in the shadow here. I'm going to keep it pretty minimal though. So I'm going to lighten the background a little bit to contrast with the shadow of the chin. So I'm just kind of scratching in and doing a little hatching and cross hatching. Generally, we kind of want to have a a lighter background where we've got a darker edge and a darker background where we've got a lighter edge. So we sometimes fudge things in a little bit, especially if we're not necessarily trying to get a specific background. Also want to leave a little black border to separate the teeth from the background, anywhere that it's going to be light. And then just a little bit of hatching and cross-hatching. And how you do this and what you do with this is up to you. You can kind of stylize it however you please. I'm just going to show you kind of the basic idea here. There we go. Now I'm going to make kind of a thicker line back here. This is where the lion's shoulder and back are. I'm going to add a little bit of hatching and cross-hatching to separate the background from the foreground. Kind of thicken that line to show that the body's going down. I'm going to make this a little more bold to separate it from the body back there. And there we go. So you can see with a nice range of values from light to dark, we've got kind of a more three-dimensional feeling lion going on. We've got a lot of texture happening. Got a pretty interesting scratchboard image here. I'm going to keep lightening this background. I'm going to keep my background pretty rough, kind of leave the marks. You can be real meticulous if you want. I'm going to go ahead and make the lion saying something now, just for fun. You can make it saying whatever you want. I'm going to make it say "rawr." You don't have to make yours talk. That's not really an important part of this. Yours can be saying nothing. That's fine. You can add a little background if you want. Whatever. You get creative with this. But mine's going to be saying "rawr." I think what I'm going to do is just kind of leave the speech bubble black here and whiten the lettering. "Rawr!" with an exclamation mark. I'm going to use my leaf-tipped stylus here. Scratch out the white. And there we go. Alright, I'm going to speed this up a little bit because it's boring. Alright, add a little more texture to the body. Feeling pretty close to finished on this. I'm going to add a few last details. I'm going to add some whiskers here. Coming down from the muzzle there. Just like that. And then a little more light on the chin fur. Just kind of separate that out. And that just about wraps us. So, let's see where we're at now. You can pause here if you need to and get to about this point here. And that's about it. I think we're pretty close to done. I'm going to add a few more finishing details. You should do the same. I'll lighten it up here a little bit, get a little more contrast. Having that contrast really helps the image pop. So don't be afraid to go real light on the light areas and keep the shadows dramatic. That can really kind of pop the image. There we go, kind of lightening this up. I'm liking the increase of contrast here quite a bit. If you make a mistake, if you kind of scratch onto an area you don't want to, it's not a big deal as long as you've got kind of a lot going on in a complex image. If you're doing kind of a boring line drawing and you make a mistake, it is kind of a big deal. But you can be a little more painterly when you are applying a lot of textures and shading. So that really makes it a lot more fun doing the scratchboards that way. Now that mane is really looking lustrous and full and tangly and wild. I'm really liking the effect with this wire brush here. And there's our lion. That's pretty much it. I'll leave a still image here in just a second for you to reference if you need to catch up. But that pretty much takes care of it. Thanks for watching today, everybody, and have yourselves a good time arting it up. All right, goodbye. You pause here if you want to catch up on this, and we'll see you next time.
Tell me that you ain't. We're gonna draw, 'cause I'm laying down the law. We're gonna art. If you don't like it, smell a flower. 'Cause I'm not good with the power. Who's the boss? Who's the boss?